please.
That's great. Oh, now? Okay, sorry. All right, I guess we're starting. Okay, well, hello everyone. Today I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Cory Buxton to our virtual seminar. So Dr. Buxton is a professor and program chair of science and mathematics education at Oregon State University in Corvallis. And before coming to OSU, he was a faculty member at the University of Georgia, and before that, the University of Miami. Right now, his research focuses on fostering more equitable science learning opportunities for all students and especially for multilingual learners. And his most recent work, a new NSF grant, on developing a model of teacher professional learning that connects, students' language development, cultural connections to science, and knowledge of STEM career pathways. And with that short introduction, please join me in welcoming Dr. Buxton.
Thanks, Kayla, and thanks everybody for coming and hanging out. I'm really excited to be here and chat with you all for a while. I've planned about 35 minutes of presentation and then hope that we can engage in discussion and conversation. Hopefully I'm going to share my screen correctly here. Start the slideshow and then share screen to the slideshow. All right, you see the slides? Great. Excellent. So the topic of my talk is how perspectives from linguistically diverse classrooms can help all students unlock the language of science. And this may be a somewhat unusual topic for this group to think about, but I want to make the case that all of us use the language of science, but we may not think about it explicitly. So we're going to do some explicit thinking about it today. And we're all science educators and science communicators in one way, shape, or form. And so I think we can all benefit from thinking a little more explicitly about how we support our students and how we support them around language. And finally, this idea of linguistically diverse classrooms, I think biologists understand sometimes studying a special population with particular characteristics can help us see other things more generally and broadly in the broader population. So some of my focus on linguistically diverse classrooms is because I care about that population and their needs, but part of it is I think they often are a really interesting population to look at to understand more broadly some things about language. So that's a little bit of, I hope, how this talk will connect to sort of what you think about. So a bit of overview. My research overall is grounded in a long-standing interest in broadening participation in science, which began when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Guatemala a long time ago now. But I met so many people who were rural subsistence farmers who were so smart, really smart people who just never had the opportunity to go to school, get an education, and get out of the fields. And I recognized this disconnect between intelligence and potential and education, and the role of education potentially in really making a difference in people's lives. And I see broadening participation obviously as an equity issue, but I also think it makes for better science. I think there's good evidence to show that when we broaden and diversify the folks at the table, the folks asking the questions, the folks coming up with methods to answer them, we get richer and more robust science when we get broader perspectives. So I think it's about the science and not just about equity. And I've come to believe personally that a key to preparing and supporting a more diverse STEM workforce is to better understand the role that language plays in science learning and also in science interest and identity. Because I think interest and identity have a lot to do with why someone sticks with the very sometimes hard and arduous path of science training. You have to really believe it's for you and that it's for some purpose and that you see yourself in it. So in the first part of my talk, I want to unpack the language of science a little bit generally, sort of think about why scientific language is the way it is. And then we'll start to talk about how to apply those ideas to teaching, learning, and communicating about science at all levels. I'll talk a little bit about K-12 education, and then hope to engage you in thinking about what some of this means, what are the implications in higher education. So the STEM workforce and STEM workforce development was already at something of a crossroads before COVID. And there's a couple major changes going on that affect STEM workforce pathways. One is we know that our student and community demographics in the US are changing. US public schools are now majority minority, which is a term that makes no sense. They're majority non-white. And also we've got increasing numbers of multilingual learners, students going to school learning in a language that is not their home language. About 10% of our K-12 students go to school in a second language. And so this is not an issue just for special teachers or ESOL teachers. This is an issue that all teachers now confront. We also have, at least in the K-12 world, those of you who are parents may be aware of this, a new set of science education standards as of 2014, the next generation science standards, which focus more. We've had a curriculum in K-12 science education that has been described as a mile wide and an inch deep. We cover way too many topics and not enough depth, and people get a bunch of factoids, but they don't put the pieces together. And so the new standards are really about depth over breadth and focusing on practices that scientists and engineers use and connecting those to how we know some of the big ideas in science. And finally, the actual jobs, the career landscape is changing. STEM is driving nearly all the high growth living wage jobs. 18 of the 20 job and career titles that are tops on the Department of Labor list of preferred jobs are in STEM fields. So everybody needs to try on this possibility. Even kids who don't think they're science learners may want to try on the possibility of STEM careers. So my work on broadening participation over the years has focused on three broad areas. Language development is the first of those, because we know that we all use language to represent what we know, but we also use language to represent who we are. So if you think about science learners, they're making choices about their fit for science, partly based on how accessible the language feels or doesn't feel. But all students can learn to use language that matches their purposes as consumers and producers of scientific meaning if we give them the tools to do that. I also focus a lot on the idea of culturally sustaining pedagogies. How do we help students see, because most students don't see their cultures, their communities, their histories represented in science, either in school or in society. And we need to help students think about sort of the place-based and community knowledge that they do have and how it connects to the work of science, because it does connect, but we just have to help them see how it does. And finally, this idea of knowledge building, cumulative knowledge, a creation over time, right? That scientific understanding comes from the connections we see and the explanations we can give about those connections. But students often learn science in bits and pieces, knowledge in pieces, I sometimes say. And then we ask them to do the hard work of putting those pieces together. We could do more to help them do that. But this talk, I really want to focus on the first of those strands, and that is the language piece. I have a new grant and a new project called LACUNOS, which stands for Language, Culture, and Knowledge Building Through Science. So getting ready for this talk was super helpful in helping me get ready to talk more about some of these ideas. So thanks for this opportunity. So I want to brainstorm with you for just a minute and let people chime in a little bit, maybe in chat or some call outs. So I want to talk a little bit about why science language sounds that way. We all know science language sounds a certain way. Kids can identify language as sounding sciencey, but what is sciencey about science language? Why does it sound that way? So any thoughts either in chat or call out? Anything you think about why the language of science sort of sounds the way it does?
If it's confusing to understand, usually it's sciencey.
All right, a great comment in the chat that it's based in Latin and Greek often. Yeah, great. Any other thoughts?
Uncommonly used words.
Yeah, specialized words that you don't hear every day.
Definitions are usually really specific.
Really specific and very technical language, Anne says. Great, any other thoughts? Precise, but often highly qualified. Yeah, we always have a lot of caveats, right? Yeah. So great. I mean, you all obviously think about this quite a bit, but it has evolved. Obviously, language evolves for certain purposes, and it isn't just to be confusing to students, although that is one of the byproducts. That's not the goal, right? And the language of science is often described as having two sets of characteristics, technicality and rationality. And the technicality piece comes from the word choices, the lexical resources. So when you think about the technical language and vocabulary, and we're always coming up with new words to try to be more precise, more concise, more descriptive, more nuanced in ideas that get more and more complex and nuanced over time. So bioinformatics, neuroparasitology, your website actually is full of these kinds of technical words, right? And that's pretty obvious, like those are easy to spot. But there's also the rationality piece, and that is about the grammatical structure of language that's meant to support certain kinds of reasoning and argument. And that's more subtle. So it's easy to pick out the vocabulary and harder sometimes to pick out these grammatical structures. So where does this all come from? As was mentioned in the chat, we can tie this back to Greek and Latin, and particularly conceptually to Greek philosophy. So it's not just about vocabulary and kind of those prefixes, suffixes, and roots, but it's also about this philosophical intent. Think back to Philosophy 101, way back when, this desire to describe abstract ideas in ways that were more persistent and therefore could be categorized, as opposed to kind of the transient things that pass through our lives so quickly that they're hard to capture. And so you can see this in Plato's idea of ideal forms, which was this kind of wacky notion that there's this other world of perfect forms, and we only see a shadow of that. So when we see a horse and we see all horses are slightly different, that's because they're imperfect reflections or shadows of an idealized horse form that exists in a plane that we don't have access to. But that idea of wanting to have these kind of abstract but solid things that we could then reason about was a key piece of how they were trying to bring new language to philosophy. And we see that again really clearly when we move ahead to sort of Enlightenment era science in Europe, that this language, just like the language of philosophy, required more stable and persistent linguistic forms for the purpose of creating technical taxonomies. We were trying to classify and have these taxonomies. And so we needed new language to make meaning of these new ideas. But we needed the language to help us sort of capture things in a way that we could classify them. So how does language do this? One of the key mechanisms that language uses to do this is what some have described as grammatic drift. So grammatic drift is a linguistic mechanism that helps language change for different purposes. So it's basically a shift from describing a circumstance, like circumstances are unstable, they're ephemeral, it's raining today. That is hard to do much with because it's going to change, right? But we can change that to a quality that's more generalizable, like it's rainy in the PNW. So changing that it's raining to it's rainy makes it more of a quality that has some power to stick around, right? And then we can go further from that to like an abstract entity that's sort of conceptual or theoretical, but also stable and persistent. So we might say we've got a wet winter subtropical climate, and that is a way to describe the same thing in a form that is going to stick around and we can work with. So in effect, grammatically, we're taking verbs like raining and adjectives like rainy and making them into nouns so that move becomes motion and eroding surfaces become surface erosion. And so some people have described this as turning everything into passive voice. And it is that, but really why it's doing it is this idea of drifting from more ephemeral to more permanent grammatical structures. And this process supports theorizing about everyday experience into the types of scientific concepts that we use all the time through this linguistic mechanism. So this is the kind of way that linguists think about a language like the language of science in a way that maybe scientists don't often think about. And some of this work comes from an Australian linguist named Michael Halliday. And Halliday has a system of language, thinking about language, that he calls SFL, or Systemic Functional Linguistics. And part of it was a way to, he was studying all the different disciplines. He was comparing like, how does science language differ from history language, differ from the language of mathematics, and trying to think about what are the linguistic features that cause and allow these disciplines to sort of take language in slightly different directions through the work over time. So the idea of technical vocabulary, which is the most obvious, this idea of creating more stable linguistic classes through grammatical drift is another. And then the third in science that we do a lot, he calls lexical density, and that is sort of packing a lot of information into short, dense clauses to try to be efficient with our language. So we'll define a term that's very complex, and then we'll keep using that term, and that term brings along with it all that other understanding. And that's fine if it's one term, but you can sort of do a linguistic analysis of science papers where you start building up these definitions upon definitions, then putting all those defined terms together, and you end up with these clauses that maybe only have 6 or 7 words, but when you start unpacking them, there's so much in there because every term in that clause is just full of all these other meanings. And so that's great for people who are insiders, right? We do this. This is not to make it hard, right? This is not to confuse students. This is to be efficient to communicate to other insiders. But of course, sometimes we're communicating to outsiders, or we're apprenticing outsiders to become insiders. And then we really need to stop and think, are we packing this language so densely that we're just expecting a lot from anybody to unpack all the meanings that are buried in it? So those are some of the key features of the language of science. But the other important contribution, I think, for SFL, that's a broader contribution, is thinking about language as functional rather than structural. When I was in school, we learned that language emerged through grammar and had these structures, and we spent a lot of time learning grammar structures and how to parse sentences into, subject, object, verb 1, verb 2. And really, that's such a misguided way to think about language and teaching language. Language is functional. It's for doing stuff. It's for learning. It's for doing. And so to step back and decontextualize it like that makes no sense, but we do have to understand the purposes. And so in this SFL framework, Halliday argues that we always have 3 purposes. Anytime we communicate, science or not, we always have 3 purposes. There's always, he calls them meta functions because he's a social scientist, so everything's got a label, right? So the ideational purpose or meta function is really just, what's the idea? What's the subject matter that we're trying to communicate? We're always talking about something. So climate change is real. I'm trying to make the case that climate change is real. So that's the idea. But of course, there's also always the interpersonal, sort of what is the voice I'm trying to use as I'm trying to communicate. So is this something I'm trying to persuade someone who's a skeptic and I need a persuasive argument? Is it a factual report for a different type of audience? Am I just trying to tell a funny story about something that happened? That voice is going to be different based on the interpersonal dynamic of the communication. And then finally, there's the modality or the textual function, the medium of communication. Am I taking notes in a lab notebook? Am I writing a journal article? Am I writing a newspaper op-ed? Am I giving an oral report in class? Am I just chatting with a colleague? The way I'm going to engage with the text through some medium of communication is always going to also change my purpose. So the idea here is, if we're aware of our purposes, then we can tailor our language to be more efficient and more effective. And that's really what this is all about, is trying to use language to meet our needs. So how does all this help us think in new ways about the language of science? First of all, if we accept that it's language purposes that drive language structures and how language has evolved, then we need to think about demystifying this language for students and for the public, while also rethinking our own language choices. And of course we do this. We don't always use the same language. We recognize, I mean, everybody recognizes this if you spent any time, especially teaching, that you have to talk in different ways to different people at different times. But to really try to be explicit about how and why we do that, that's what this is about. And also to just recognize that linguistic choices are always guided by their context and purposes. So objectively, there's not good or bad language. There's just good or bad fit for the purpose at hand. So if I did a good job in getting my communication across to you, then I made the right choices. And if you end up confused, then I did something wrong in my communication. And I need to think about, how can I communicate that more effectively next time? Third, we need to understand how language both shapes and is shaped by the evolution of any discipline or field. So we could develop some awareness of why the language in our discipline sounds the way it does. We're not going to suddenly change it just to meet somebody else's needs. Like the language of science, the language of your discipline is what it is. We can help make it clearer. We can sometimes make other choices, but also we need to look at and help other people understand that we're not trying to be dense or abstruse or unclear. There's reasons why these ideas require certain kinds of language. And finally, the idea that our communication really at the end of the day should focus on meaning making and therefore using all the resources that learners have. So if they come with multiple languages, how do we use all those languages? How do we use kinesthetic and enacted and embodied teaching as well as just sort of verbal and lecture? How do we use models? Science is full of models, graphic representations, all of these resources. How do we help learners think about leveraging all these different resources in the right way for the right purpose to make their argument? And we do all this, but I think we could do it more explicitly. This is really a call, I think, for being more explicit about some of the things we do and a little more thoughtful about some of the choices that we make. So to apply these ideas a little bit in K-12 settings first, and this is really the space that I tend to work in, some of the same features that make the language of science powerful, we know also make it confusing, but not just confusing, potentially alienating. So I really want to highlight this idea about interest and identity, and not just like, can you do it, but do you want to do it? And there's lots of kids, honestly, who can do science, who decide that they don't want to do science because some disconnect around the interest and identity piece, it doesn't feel right to them. And not everybody needs to pursue science, but we want people who have the skills and the dispositions to also get connected in a way that it's going to feel inviting. We honestly turn a lot of people off from science that maybe would have thrived, right? So we need to think about that. Like I've said before, language both shapes and is shaped by our experience. And so we need to be more sort of meta aware of that. And when we think about children, and of course, those of you who are parents recognize this, children, of course, begin with oral language and sort of the immediate world of their direct experience. And that's what they have to learn from. But then we get to learn to read, and we get multimedia. And this opens up our minds and our experiences to language and places and people that extend beyond what we've directly observed. And so giving kids rich ways to expand their experiences is a critical thing to do for young children. And of course, this is an equity issue because it's well documented that families that have more educated family members who have more resources are both more aware of the need to expose kids to broad language and experiences, and of course, more able to do that. I grew up around Washington, D.C. I got to go to the Smithsonian Institution umpteen million times when I was a kid. That was my school. I learned so much more from the Smithsonian than I ever did from my K-12 formal education. And that was a privilege. And I didn't know it was a privilege. I thought every kid got that. And I remember recognizing when I learned later, wow, that was so lucky that I had that. That was so transformative for me. And so many kids don't get those kinds of experiences. But we can do more as educators, though, to give those experiences. We can control only what we can control, but we can give lots of experiences to kids. If we give them the right experiences, then we can build language from that. But of course, nothing replaces, for kids anyway, engaging with peers in hands-on experiences and discovery and discourse to support learning. And that's why this pandemic is so tragic, I think, for so many kids, is that they've lost that ability to engage in person. This Zoom world is not the same. We can function in it because we have a lot of resources to build on. And I see a lot of kids struggling who don't have those resources to build on, and they're not getting the rich sort of embodied experiences that they should be getting. And finally, back to the next generation science standards, this idea of three-dimensional learning framework that highlights practices and big ideas and is drilling down to really try to get some deep learning rather than broad and shallow, requires sort of explicit focus on the language needed to do that.
Hey, Cory.
Yeah.
In that previous photo, are you having students make s'mores with a solar stove? Is that what?
Yes,
that
yes,
is?
that's making solar ovens and then cooking s'mores in a solar oven. Yeah.
That is fantastic. Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. So in K-12, we do a lot to try to support some of these ideas. I'm afraid that in higher ed, many folks are not quite as focused on this, and maybe we don't do quite as good a job. I think we tend to offload a lot of the thinking about how to support students' needs to be successful to tutoring centers and student support centers, and faculty sort of go, that's not really in my wheelhouse, somebody else needs to take care of that. We know we've got a lot of international students as well as US students who come with a home language that is not English and are learning in a second language, learning in a different culture. And we sometimes acknowledge that this is hard for them, and we acknowledge that it's a challenge, but we don't do very much to actually make it easier. And then finally, I wonder, where can students, especially if they're sitting in a lecture hall like this one, where do they gain the meta-linguistic awareness and the opportunity to practice communicating their own scientific ideas? Because it's not often coming, at least in a class like this, it's not coming. Okay? So there's a lot more we could do in higher ed, probably. But one possible space where we could do some of this may be research labs. So way back when, over 20 years ago now, when I was doing my dissertation, I did an ethnographic study of a university biology department that had an explicit vision of and an explicit commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They said, we're going to be a place where we are going to recognize and value diversity. We're going to train people to go out and change the world around diversity in biology. And we're going to do a lot of things explicitly to help students succeed and thrive who maybe otherwise might not. So that's pretty unusual, I think. Two specific things that they did that I remember very clearly. One was a real commitment to teach everything explicitly to newcomers, new students coming into the program, classes, new faculty coming in, new postdocs, whoever it was. There was lots and lots of explicit attempts to explain how we operate, why we do things here, that, how do we function, including things like language and norms and the different spaces, and learning to negotiate. A lot of it was learning to negotiate the different spaces. How do you succeed working in a lab? How do you succeed in the classes? How do you succeed, journal club, lots of different things. And how do you succeed in those spaces really explicitly? What do you need to do? What's the language? What's the practices? What's the culture? Making it explicit. And then super explicitly in the journal clubs, and there were a lot of journal clubs because they believed that learning to sort of read and make sense of journal articles was a fundamental skill that was required and needed a lot more attention than it tended to get. Every journal club meeting, there was an explicit time set aside to look at the language of the article, to actually deconstruct the argument sort of rhetorically. Now, it wasn't sometimes about like the vocabulary, but it was about the rhetorical structure, but it was very much a language-focused discussion. It wasn't just about the substance of the article, but what is the argument and how are the authors making their case? And are they doing it well? And how could it be better? And what was strong about it? What was weak about it? And I thought that was, again, not like we never do that, but to really make that a focused part of every journal club meeting seemed to me to be different and positive. So there's a bunch of ideas, and I don't know, I might have been quicker than I thought, but I really want to engage us now in sort of dialogue if you're willing. I've certainly got other things I could talk about, but I'd like to sort of open it up and talk about sort of language and communication that you're already doing. What's happening in your research, learning, teaching spaces? How do newcomers get apprenticed into new groups? Do you ever talk about language and culture with folks? What are you already doing to support science communication? And then I'm especially interested in any ideas that are bubbling up for you all through this conversation, new ideas about things to think about, things to try. And yeah, let me pause there and hopefully engage us in conversation. So things in the chat or shout things out.
I loved your idea that you mentioned in your previous slide about your dissertation study of like having any newcomers come to the lab, of being incredibly explicit and very methodical about introducing everything and talking about how you do things, why you do things, how each thing works. I think it's been in my experience, like coming into labs, especially through the rotation system that we use for graduate students, is sometimes you come into a space and you're kind of expected to know how things work already. And there's some level of mentorship that occurs, but that happens to varying degrees. How involved, say, the rest of the lab mates or the PIs in directing your initial education of the lab. And so I think the emphasis of making that just a standard practice of just being overly involved in the beginning is, I think, would help a lot of students and people coming in just to know the lay of the land and a lot better like foundational understanding of what's happening. So I love that idea. That's great.
So I liked what you were talking about earlier about kind of the grammar of the language of science and how we have these we turn these sort of simple concepts we turn like verbs into adjectives and then into nouns. And I find that when I'm communicating like my science, even to other scientists who aren't in my field, those like jargony nouns like trip up communication. And I guess I'm curious if you or anybody else has sort of like skills or strategies for identifying those like highly specific grammatical structures and then deconstructing them into language that is more accessible.
Yeah, one specific thing that I have tried to do is ask people to rewrite sentences in multiple ways for different purposes and different audiences, and then to sort of think about what changes did you make in the language and what changes didn't you make. And the first thing people think about doing is taking out some of the really big vocabulary words that are super specialized and replacing them with descriptions of what they mean, right? And so that's a very practical thing, but people tend not to actually look at the grammatical structure of the sentences. And if you get used to writing for science, you quickly fall into this habit of passive voice writing that takes the subject out of the sentence. And another thing that this grammatical structure does is it makes things seem more objective by often removing the actor. So instead of like, people cut down trees and this happened, it's like trees were cut down and then this. And so we take out the actors often, and changing some of our sentence structures into more sort of standard, with putting the actor back in and having sort of like subject, verb, object grammatical construction can sometimes help clarify. So that's one specific thing. And to take that to one additional level, when we're working with second language learners, we'll often do like four-way. I'll do like a cross, and there'll be 4 boxes, and you do it sort of everyday language and then super sciencey language in English, and then try to do that again in Spanish or Russian or whatever your other language is, and then think about, are the structures the same, or are there any differences in how the 2 different languages put the words together to explain something? And sometimes people will gain insights, oh, actually the structure in Russian maybe would be easier to understand than the structure we use in English. And so sometimes people get insights by thinking about other languages as well as just kind of the everyday versus academic.
So are you saying that like the communication could be better if we base our scientific sentences or like model them more after our everyday language, how we would talk in a conversation, basically?
Maybe in some cases for some audiences. One of the questions I'm actually really interested in is, how far can you go with everyday language to explain more and more abstract and complex ideas before you have to turn to other language without losing important bits of the meaning? So I think we can go further than we think sometimes using everyday language. It just becomes less efficient. Like there's like the efficiency, we use concise language because it's easier for us when we're talking to insiders, but there's also the sort of correctness, like the meaning, is it the right meaning? So at some point you oversimplify to the point where the meaning changes, and that's where you've gone too far, right? But how far can we push it to simplify the language without simplifying the meaning? And we don't always want to do that, because if you're at a conference with your insiders, that would be ridiculous to do. Talk your jargon, right? But when you're not with the insiders, then we got to de-jargon it a bit.
Thanks. I thought this was a really interesting talk, and it got me thinking about like how we teach undergrads about how to read scientific papers, and that I think often that's very focused on the overall structure of a scientific paper and sort of understanding that and thinking of that as being sort of the new thing when students are getting into reading papers. But I think I hadn't thought in as much detail about the aspects of language that you discussed here about especially things like lexical density. And that just seems like a great way of sort of explaining to students, here's why this is going to read differently to you than other things you've read before. And I think even going into a paper knowing that that's why the words are different could be really helpful. So that's definitely something I'm going to be keeping in mind.
Awesome, cool. And you can unpack. That's another activity, is find the densest phrase,
right.
go through and pick out the densest, hardest
like
to understand
this single
phrases
word
you can.
means a ton. Yeah.
And then rewrite that in as much detail as you need to unpack every one of those terms. And sometimes you get like a whole page out of what was like one phrase. And then you go, wow.
Yeah, I like that.
There's a question in the chat, which is, do you have suggested resources for how to structure teaching introductions to lab spaces and reading journal articles?
Great question. On my list of articles that I should write and have not yet written, that's on there, like how to actually do this. Let me actually advance my slide a minute here. Oops. So the third bulleted one here, the book chapter I wrote with a couple of colleagues, this describes kind of this idea. It lays out much of the argument from this presentation, and then includes some examples more in the K-12 world about stuff on a couple of projects and how to sort of think about that. But I don't have, I've yet to see something that's really explicitly about how do you take these ideas and use them in kind of higher ed world. And it may exist, but I would probably know about it if it existed, and I haven't seen it. So I guess I need to write it in my spare time. I can stop sharing my screen at this point. All right, so in terms of the unpacking, you're actually talking about teaching, sharing with students that reading science may be as difficult as writing or speaking science. It's not actually designed to be scanned. Yeah, very, very good point. And of course, that's one of the things that grad students encounter pretty quickly. I thought I knew how to read. God, I don't know how to read this stuff. I need to learn new ways to read. I thought I was good at this. And yeah, so we really need to help them understand that this is not like bedtime reading a sci-fi novel. Like, you got to really use some reading strategy. So there are some specific things, that students can do, reading strategies to sort of help make your way through really, really dense stuff. And there are some. Again, so much of this work, so when I think of stuff people have written, so much of it is focused on K-12 because honestly, we think we've got all this stuff worked out. By the time kids get to college, they're supposed to know this, but of course, how could they, right? And so we need to be doing more of this in higher ed settings, but it tends to get written about in the K-12 world because that's where we know it's work. It's our work to do in the K-12 world. In higher ed, we feel like, oh, maybe that hopefully happened already, but it hasn't. Or not usually.
Something that's sort of related is that, often knowing how to email faculty is a skill that, graduate students need to get used to and learn. And so, like I always try to offer to, read emails and help with that explicitly because it's a thing having to do with language.
Yeah, no, if you think about all the different ways that we communicate, so I think I try with my doctoral students, and my work is different. I don't have like a lab per se, but I've got doc students that work with me, and we have a weekly lab meeting. And one of the things we do talk about is all the different in the first year, like what are all the different ways we communicate with people, with your dissertation committee, with, and really think about how to give a professional, like, how do you want to be seen? How do you want to represent yourself? You're new, people are getting to know you. How do you want to be seen? And we want you to be yourself, but we also want you to be your best professional self, and not to be phony, but also to recognize that there are some hidden, sometimes sort of codes of conduct that, you need to learn, and someone should make them explicit for you. So I do, again, I think if there's one takeaway from this talk, make things explicit. When you're in the role of teaching, try to be as explicit as you can about as much as you can.
Go ahead, Bill.
Great. Sorry, I'm actually outside walking, and I've been listening to the conversation, which was really enlightening to me, to just listen and the clarity with which you actually presented the ideas. So one question I had that has to do with what you were saying in terms of thinking about the different audiences and unpacking and explaining things different way. And I've sometimes wondered about whether there needs to be trade-offs in accuracy and precision, or if you've thought about that, and whether, so for example, maybe in some cases it's precise to a certain number is appropriate, and in another case rounding off is totally fine. So I'm just wondering if you'd thought about that in terms of that balance of accuracy and precision and understandability.
Yeah, that's great. I don't know that I've thought exactly about that, but I definitely get what you're saying. And I mean, I do think that we assume sometimes that we have to always think about those things in the, the most rigorous way, and to really think about because there are trade-offs, to recognize the trade-offs. Like there's not a right answer, right? But to recognize there's a cost to, extreme precision, right? And it may not be needed. And part of that cost may be in a lack of clarity for some people. And so just, again, asking ourselves these questions, like, I'm trying to be inclusive, I'm trying to be accurate, I'm trying to be precise, I'm also trying to be inclusive. So maybe that's a third lens to bring, and that may pull you in certain other directions. It's an interesting thing to think about, though.
Great, thanks. Yeah, sometimes I felt like I'm cheating people by not being as precise and as accurate, but it's really good to different lens. It may not actually be working against the goal of understanding.
Yeah,
So
there may be other, it's a trade-off. There may be other goals as well. Nice.
I mean, in my experience, when I'm writing papers and things, I try really hard to make things not jargony and understandable. And so, I mean, there's definitely limits to this, but in my experience, there's, at least at first, not necessarily a trade-off between precision and understandability, but it takes a lot of work to push it in that direction. And so maybe something that we need to work on more is just making that more explicitly a goal, right? And something that's worth putting work into.
Yeah, I mean, right. So part of it is, where do we invest our time, which is our most limited, commodity often. And I get that what I'm promoting, there's trade-offs there too. Because if you spend, 20 minutes of your journal club meeting unpacking the language of the argument, that is 20 minutes that you didn't spend talking about the substance of the paper. And, sometimes, talking about the substance of the paper may be way more important. That's cool, right? But we always err on the side of, oh, the substance, it's got to be the science is what's the most important. And, but the language undergirds it, right? And so if we don't invest the time, like we say to K-12 teachers all the time, classroom management, learning to sort of control and manage a classroom, it takes a lot of time in the beginning of the year to get the classroom running the way you want it to. But I can tell when I walk into a classroom in November, I can tell if the teacher put that time in up front to build a classroom community and build an understanding of classroom discourse. And I'm not talking about perfect behavior where the kids are silent. I'm talking about kids who know how to work together and work in groups and move around the room and get what they need and pair with somebody and answer a question, rather than go crazy when they're given a little bit of freedom. And so you have to invest the time up front to build the community that you want, and then you reap the benefits of that the rest of the year, and you'll get further. By the end of the year, you're way out in front, even though it cost you time up front. So to some degree, that same argument may hold true bringing someone up to speed in a lab or anything else you do. The time invested up front will pay off down the road.
I really like that idea that you talked about of in journal clubs explicitly talking about the argument, like how the argument is presented, because I feel like that happens sometimes sort of organically where we'll talk about the story arc of a paper, and whether that the way they've presented it does service to their like conclusions, or if it makes it harder to understand. And I kind of want to make that a more explicit thing with each journal club. Like, it's really easy to spend all of journal club trashing a paper, and so I usually try to like say, okay, what is the one thing we learned from this, or like what can we gain from this paper? But I feel like I also want to start doing the thing where it's like, how did they present their argument, and was that like helpful or detrimental? Because I feel like that would help everybody, especially grad students, kind of learning how to write papers for the first time, to think about like what are the argument structures, or what are the paper structures, or the or whatever that like make a paper good or communicate well.
Yep, they're going to have to do it. They're going to have to learn, and we can make it a little, it's never going to be easy, right? But it can be made a little more doable by learning along the way more about those structures, the rhetorical structures. Yeah. I'm
interested in knowing, I mean, we could also find and read your dissertation, but
no, don't do that.
What were some of the other like measures that the lab that you studied had in place for addressing diversity that you think were really helpful? Because I feel like this is a topic that we've been more focused on recently, and is definitely more of an interest for a lot of labs to implement. So.
Yeah. So the driving force behind this was a new department chair in the department coming in, who was the first woman who had ever been department chair at this university of the biology department. But it wasn't that she was a woman, it was that she had an explicit commitment to diversity. And she happened to be a woman, but I don't think it's quite surprising that it was a woman who sort of pushed this agenda. But so she came in sort of with this, when she interviewed, she was very upfront. She said, this is part of what I want to do. And are you the institution that's going to let me do it, or should I look elsewhere? So I thought that was pretty cool. And so basically, a lot of it was about mentoring. A lot of it was about just trying to prepare people for the rigorous world of research biology, but doing it in a humane way and in a nurturing way and in a community way. So I think really fundamentally for her, it was about building a type of community that would support each other and wasn't cutthroat and wasn't backstabbing, but was really trying to, get everybody pushing for everybody else. And maybe that is more common now. I think maybe we've become a little more humane in the past 20 years, but maybe not. But so I think a lot of it was really with an eye towards community building. What can we do to build the kind of community that I envision, that I want as the leader of this department? And so making things explicit was a big piece of that, but really just trying to bring interdisciplinary, people of all, bringing the new students with the senior students, with faculty, just trying to create spaces where people could get to know each other, learn about each other as full human. She often said, like, we're not disembodied brains, we're full human beings. And so trying to recognize our full humanity and know each other as full human beings and not just as disembodied brains. I think that was kind of the overarching sort of philosophy. And then the practices, sort of people tried to be creative about, okay, what would help us build this vision? What would that look like? And so the practices sort of came from there. So it was a really interesting space. So I should tell you the sort of unfortunate side of the story is thinking like an anthropologist, because I was studying this space as a cultural anthropologist would, right? And so this idea that you can create a space that does all those things, but that space has bounds around it and the rest of the world may not have changed along with you. So there were actually, in the 2 years that I was hanging out there were multiple examples of people who went out on the job market and came back crushed because they were like, I got trained in one way of, I thought the field had moved in certain ways and was acted in certain ways. And I went out there and I realized it's a lie. That's not what it's like. It may be like that here, but it wasn't like that other places where I was looking to work. And now I want to find a place that feels like this, and I'm afraid they don't exist. So that's part of the story too, is like we can make changes in the spaces that we can control, but we also need to prepare people that not every space is the same. And thinking like a systemic functional linguist, we need to think about language and culture in the different spaces we go to, and we can't assume that space B is going to be like space A, and we need to adapt and think differently and use language and think, differently in different spaces.
I feel like that same issue can happen in the reverse direction too, where you can have a department that has like a really strong community focus, but then if you have people who are coming out of PhD programs from really cutthroat, like competitive environments, that they can kind of inoculate that culture into the resident culture and change it for, like, potentially not for the better.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Well, this kind of morphed into questions really naturally. So I just wanted to, we're getting close to the end of time. So I wanted to take the time to thank Dr. Buxton for coming and helping enlighten us on a lot of our language around science. And we're just gonna move this into tea time. So if anybody has more questions, we can this is just an opportunity for anybody who needs to go to leave at this time. So thank you, Dr. Buxton. Appreciate it.
Thanks everybody for coming. Please stick around if you like. And I'm up the road in Corvallis. I would love